About the nitrogen cycle. Why do we want to know about the nitrogen cycle? Why do we care about the nitrogen cycle? In particular, we care about it because it's critical for life. As you probably know, nitrogen comprises about 78% of our atmosphere. But the nitrogen in our atmosphere is bound up as dinitrogen, which is a very strong chemical bond that's hard to break. And in fact, specialized enzymes and specialized structures are required for so-called biological nitrogen fixation, where nitrogen is taken out of the atmosphere and into some sort of organism. On the other hand, the energy provided by lightning can result in breaking that chemical bond, that dinitrogen chemical bond, and reducing nitrogen to ammonium, which can then fall out as rain and enter into terrestrial ecosystems in that way. And then finally, there's a process of nitrogen fixation that we call industrial fixation, and that's the so-called Haber-Bosch process, where basically fossil fuel energy is used to break that chemical bond and then reduce that dinitrogen into inorganic forms of nitrogen. And the reason we did that originally, the Haber-Bosch process was invented for making inorganic nitrogen that was used in explosives, and they were used quite extensively during both World Wars. But after World War II, we found ourselves with an excessive capacity to create inorganic nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch process. And what we realized is that we could use that nitrogen to fertilize our agricultural systems to spur and stimulate plant growth. And so it was a critical part of the so-called green revolution. So nitrogen gets added often as fertilizer. That form of fertilizer is an inorganic form. It's either ammonium or nitrate, or it's bound up in some organic form. So those are sort of the three main forms that we see it being added to agroecosystems. When it's added to agroecosystems, it tends to stimulate plant growth because most plants in agroecosystems are nitrogen limited in temperate parts of the globe. And when that stimulates plant growth, of course, that can be translated to increases in livestock performance, because not only are the plants growing more, they tend to have a higher nitrogen content, and then when that is fed to livestock, the microbes in those livestock in their stomachs benefit from the higher levels of energy that's in that nitrogen, and so the livestock tend to grow more and produce more livestock products. And then, as is depicted in this cartoon, eventually those livestock excrete a lot of nitrogen, and a lot of nitrogen is returned to agroecosystems in organic forms as well. Here it's depicted in a cartoon form as a cow. But similarly to the way nitrogen stimulates growth of microbes in ruminant stomachs, that also stimulates microbial growth in soils as nitrogen enters back into the soils. Again, usually in an inorganic form, although in the case of manure, a lot of that nitrogen is also bound up in an organic form. Now, importantly, there are loss pathways really depicted by one arrow here, but there are many arrows, and we'll talk about those here in a minute, for nitrogen to be lost from the agroecosystem, from the soil, plant, animal part of the agroecosystem. And so we'll talk more about that here as we move along. As I mentioned, nitrogen has been used to stimulate crop yields, and you can see here its use really took off in the late 30s. And as we came out of World War II, I mentioned we had an excess amount of nitrogen production capacity, and it's really spurred on most of the gains that we've seen in crop yields, along with genetic improvements that have happened to those corn crops, not just corn crops, but wheat, barley, etc. And so those crops have all taken advantage of the higher levels of nitrogen that are included in these agricultural systems. On the other hand, if we look globally at where nitrogen is in soils and in ecosystems, what this graphic depicts is that there are some places where there are deficiencies of nitrogen, and those tend to be found in more or less impoverished places and in places where soils aren't very productive. I mean, that's why they aren't very productive, because they're low in nitrogen. But then there are also places that have an excessive amount of nitrogen. And you can see here that Southeast Asia is one of those places. Southeastern United States is one of those places. Much of Mexico is one of those places. And then, of course, Northern Europe is one of those places. And the reason that nitrogen is found in excess in these places is directly attributable to human use of it. So humans have taken it out of the atmosphere through these processes that I described, largely industrial fixation, and added them into these systems and to the tune of them being excessive. And those excesses come at a tremendous cost to society, and some of those costs are listed here. So the main costs. The first that's listed is eutrophication, which is the addition of nitrogen to ecosystems where it really does cause lots of problems. And so one of the classic examples of this is what's known as the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And every year, a tremendous amount of nutrients, nitrogen in particular, come down the Mississippi River as they drain out of the Mississippi River watershed, which extends all the way up into Minnesota and Canada, and as far west as Nebraska, and as far east as Ohio. So it's a huge continental scale watershed, but it's draining its drain waters, its runoff, and leaching waters carry with it a tremendous amount of nitrogen that's largely coming from the nitrogen that's added to agricultural ecosystems. Excessive nitrogen in drinking water has led to human health issues, in particular in toddlers and infants whose hemoglobin concentrations in their blood is low. Nitrate in drinking water, a form of nitrogen that leaches into groundwater systems, can bind onto hemoglobin and compromise the human's ability to carry oxygen in the blood. And so there have been infant mortalities that have been linked to nitrogen contamination of drinking water in many places in the U.S. and worldwide. Nitrogen losses contribute significantly to climate change. The nitrous oxide, N2O, is a gaseous form of nitrogen loss from agroecosystems, and it is directly related to the amount of nitrogen that's added into the agricultural ecosystem. And then finally, biodiversity loss has been linked to excessive nitrogen use in agroecosystems, largely because as nitrogen finds its way into things like wetlands, it tends to spur on so-called nitrophilic species, those that can really take up excessive amounts of nitrogen, and that results in the displacement of other species that are not as nitrophilic and give way, and so you end up with a decrease in the diversity of those ecosystems. So there are just huge, massive costs to trying to slow down the loss of nitrogen into our atmosphere and into our waterways in particular. And so what we're going to talk about here as we move forward are opportunities to try and slow down the use of nitrogen first and foremost, but then once we use it, trying to trap it and capture it within an agroecosystem, and then finally trying to stop it from leaving that agroecosystem. So I kind of walked through the nitrogen cycle earlier in a pretty simple way, Here's a little bit more detailed way of looking at it that has some labeling for you for the nitrogen cycle. As we mentioned, nitrogen can come out of the atmosphere as when lightning occurs, because the energy provided by the lightning helps reduce dinitrogen to nitrate, and then that can enter into agroecosystems. And then nitrogen can also come in through additions of fertilizers. And so here's a industrial fixation depicted over here on the right-hand side, where dinitrogen is coming out of the atmosphere and being used to produce fertilizer. During that process, there can be a significant gaseous loss of ammonia gas, NH3. And this is as a result of a reaction, a chemical reaction that occurs during the production process. Here's symbiotic or biological fixation, where leguminous species that are in a symbiotic relationship with bacteria result in the biological fixation of nitrogen from the atmosphere, and that nitrogen then enters into the soil organic matter part of the ecosystem. So those are the three pathways for inputs of nitrogen: industrial fixation, biological fixation, which is via plants and rhizobium bacteria in symbiosis, and finally this lightning-based fixation level. Okay, so then once nitrogen gets into the system, as we've talked about, it can be taken up by plants, but it can also be transformed and taken up and transformed by microbes in the soil. So the nitrogen enters the system. Let's say that nitrogen unit is taken up by plants. Some of it might be removed via harvest. Some of it might re-enter the soil and become soil organic matter. In that situation, the nitrogen is tied up in organic molecules, and those organic molecules then can be broken down by soil organisms, in particular microbes. And so there's this important step of depolymerization where microbes, in particular fungi, are exuding enzymes into the soil solution to help break down the organic matter into inorganic forms of nitrogen. And this process is known as ammonification. That's the production of ammonium in the soil, NH4. Now, NH4 is a readily available form of nitrogen for plant uptake. And so you can see here that that's depicted with this arrow. Likewise, though, it's readily available for more microbial uptake. And so microbes are more or less competing with plants to take up that inorganic form of ammonium that's been produced via this process of ammonification. Along the way, microbes are not only taking it up via this process, which is called immobilization, where they're basically taking it and using it to build their bodies. They also can use it for nitrification. And the process of nitrification is the process of taking ammonium and using it and setting up a redox gradient where the oxidation of ammonium from ammonium to nitrate provides energy for the microbes to do their metabolic activity. And so there's this process of nitrification that occurs in the soils, and that's a microbially mediated process where microbes gain energy from this nitrification process. Now, critically, this nitrification process is accelerated in aerobic soil conditions. So in the presence of oxygen, that is. And so if you have a situation where the soils are saturated or inundated with water, that displaces pore space and reduces the amount of oxygen, then we tend to slow down nitrification. There are other sets of microbes then that use nitrate to do the same sort of gaining energy from a redox reaction process. And when they do that, they produce two types of nitrogen gases. They produce dinitrogen and release it back to the atmosphere, N2, But if they don't, if oxygen isn't totally limiting, they often will that often will result in the production of nitrous oxide, N2O gas. And so you can see here that both those gases are depicted as gaseous losses of nitrogen as a result of this process of denitrification, which happens in less than aerobic conditions. So everything from reduced oxygen to almost completely anoxic or anaerobic conditions, we get denitrification. And as I was saying, the closer you get to completely anaerobic conditions or completely anoxic conditions, the more of this nitrogen comes off as dinitrogen. Now, critically, the amount of dinitrogen that comes off is a good thing. We want nitrogen gas to be recycled to the atmosphere as N2. It's relatively inert in the atmosphere. It doesn't cause the greenhouse effect. It doesn't force climate. It just recycles back to that. Remember, I said at the outset, 78% of the atmosphere is dinitrogen already. On the other hand, N2O is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so we really don't want N2O emissions to the atmosphere. We want to do everything we can to limit that. So you can see that the management of soils is really important because the amount of water that's in those soils is going to drive the ratio of dinitrogen to nitrous oxide, which has important ramifications for atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Nitrate itself, another inorganic form of nitrogen, so the two inorganic forms of soil nitrogen are ammonium and nitrate. Nitrate is available for plant uptake as well, and also available for microbial uptake, shown here as immobilization again. So we like it when the nitrogen cycle is conserved and when it's tight. And when we say it's tight, we're talking about organic matter being broken down by microbes and other organisms in the soil, and then being trapped or taken back up by microbes and plants to keep this cycle closed. We want to keep this cycle as tight and closed as possible. When we open that cycle, we do things that result in more denitrification and loss to the atmosphere, and we also make more nitrate available for leaching. And leaching is just the process of pulling nitrate down via the flow of water that's percolating down through the soil and pulling it down below the rooting zone so that it's essentially lost from this agroecosystem and can't be used anymore. And when nitrogen leaches, it eventually finds groundwater, it eventually finds surface water. And so we want to keep nitrogen away from this lost pathway of leaching, just like we want to keep it away from this lost pathway of N2O emissions. So the things that keep this nitrogen cycle tight are for it to be constrained. That is, for us not to add as much nitrogen as we possibly can. The more nitrogen we add via industrial fixation or symbiotic fixation, we don't have much control over the lightning fixation. The more we add back as manure, the more we crack open and accelerate this nitrogen cycle. And the faster that cycle is going, the more opportunities there are for loss. To decelerate and slow the nitrogen cycle helps us hold on and conserve to nitrogen, which can be a very large cost. Fertilizer nitrogen is not cheap. It's actually one of the biggest production costs that a farmer has. And so we want to do everything we can to minimize it for farmer costs and also for environmental costs, as we've talked about over here. So that's sort of the overview of the nitrogen cycle. Trust me, the nitrogen cycle can get even messier than this. We could add some arrows and talk about some other fluxes that happen within the soil, but this is really the big picture. And so we want to do everything we can to keep nitrogen in the system. Let's look very quickly here at estimates of nitrogen cycling through Canadian agroecosystems. So this work is by Jansen et al. From 2003, And Jansen breaks down the amount of nitrogen coming into the agroecosystems of Canada and estimates that about 2/3 of it is via industrial fixation, so fertilizer that we humans have produced and then gets added into the agroecosystems. 18% of it via biological fixation, which is again leguminous fixation with their through their symbiosis with bacteria, and then about 14% of it as atmospheric fixation. And so they estimate that 2.35 teragrams of nitrogen per year are entering into Canadian agricultural ecosystems. Now, of that 2.35 teragrams that's coming in, they estimate that a little under half of it, about 1 teragram of nitrogen per year, gets harvested as crop products. Okay, so that gets harvested either as grain, probably mostly as grain, or maybe even biomass via hay. And so these are plant crop products. So you can see it's about 44% of the nitrogen that comes in is harvested off in crops. About 8% comes off as animal products, largely beef and milk. And so you can see that's a relatively small amount of the nitrogen that's added to the system comes off as an animal product. So those two pathways are related to the overall nitrogen use efficiency for the system. So if we talk about how efficient the system is, the more efficient the system is, the more of the nitrogen ends up in the products that we actually harvest from the agroecosystem. What's critical here is that about 39% of the inputs are lost from the agroecosystem either to the atmosphere or to waterways, groundwater and surface water. And of that, you can see about 21% goes to the atmosphere, and about 18% of the overall inputs go to water. So roughly 40% of all the nitrogen that's added to Canadian agroecosystems, which are just a model that are similar to U.S. agroecosystems or European agroecosystems, about 40% of it goes to the environment, where it really has destructive and degrading processes. So mainly it's lost through nitrate leaching or N2O emissions, as we've talked about already. Now, importantly, some of the nitrogen does get trapped and hung up within the soil organic matter. And so you can see that about 1,000 teragrams of nitrogen is the size of the soil organic matter pool, or the average size of the organic matter pool. And one of the things we can do to reduce these loss pathways is to try to build organic matter, which contains nitrogen, that holds on to that nitrogen and keeps it from entering into the environment, and also reduces our overall need to add nitrogen into the system in order to make it very, very productive. So if we look at that same figure, we might ask questions like, how do we reduce the amount of inputs? That's one of the ways that we can help improve what's going on. How do we increase storage, as we just talked about? That would be increasing organic matter. How do we get more out of our products? And that's a big push that you can imagine. Plant breeders and animal breeders are always looking for ways to improve the nitrogen use efficiency of their production systems. And then finally, how do we reduce losses? And so there are all numbers of ways to try and reduce losses. Some of that's related to minimizing the amount of time that you have soils partially inundated to help reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Some of that has to do with trying to plant deep-rooted species that will trap and capture that nitrate that might be leaching below the rooting zone. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those opportunities. This figure, the annotation on this figure is really just recapitulating what I was just talking about, which is reducing inputs via technology, yield reduction, recycling improvements, increasing product efficiencies, and increasing the retention in the agricultural systems. So one of the ways that we can tighten up nitrogen cycles is to add nitrogen only where it's needed. So this is a spatial issue. And here's a depiction, some sort of image from above, from an airplane, showing in this field where the crops are actually nitrogen deficient. And so that this sometimes falls under the heading of precision farming, precision agriculture, and that is that you use technology to target where in the field you apply nitrogen, and that reduces your overall need for nitrogen. And so this relies very heavily on modern equipment and modernization of tractors and use of GPS technology, etc. Similarly, we talk about adding nitrogen only when it's needed. So this is trying to match up in a temporal fashion. The last slide was talking about a spatial approach. This is a temporal approach, so that if you look at the nitrogen demand of a crop, rather than applying nitrogen very, very early when the crop isn't quite needing it or using it, matching the application of nitrogen so that it more closely matches the demand by the crop, and so we have less opportunity for loss, because again the nitrogen gets taken up and held onto by the crop itself. And so you can see here this dotted line is depicting nitrogen that's being supplied by leguminous mineralization or leguminous fixation. And you can see here that one of the reasons we like to add legumes into systems, alfalfa, clovers, etc., is because they tend to be more of a time-released nitrogen input than when we add fertilizer, which tends to happen in one or two big pulses. And of course, there are opportunities through precision ag to do it in a little bit more, a little bit less of a pulse fashion and a little bit more of a time distributed way. Sometimes we try to slow the runoff of nitrogen that is happening over land. So nitrogen will run off as water runs off on the tops of soil. The more we can get water to infiltrate and percolate into soils, the better chances we have to hold on to nitrogen. And so things like contour stripping and the restoration of wetlands and all manner of vegetation impediments to the movement of water and soils across the landscape will slow down the runoff and loss of nitrogen from agroecosystems. And then finally, we try to decelerate the nitrogen cycle, as we've talked about already. And I have depicted here this pretty painting of prairie, and that's because prairie or grasslands are well known for slowing the nitrogen cycle. And the reasons for that are that prairie plants, in particular warm season prairie grasses, tend to have a high nitrogen use efficiency because they have C4 photosynthesis. They build a tremendous amount of biomass per unit nitrogen compared to C3 plants. And so when we use prairie plants in agroecosystems, that tends to increase their use efficiency just by virtue of the fact that they use C4 photosynthesis. Not only do prairie plants have high nitrogen use efficiency, they tend to have a high levels of resorption, which is the removal of nitrogen from above ground parts of the plant to the below ground part of the plant at the time of senescence. And the time of senescence is usually in Wisconsin, mid to late August through September and October. And during that period of time, the plant has usually gone to seed, and once it's set its seed, it starts to actively remove nitrogen and resorb it from the above ground stems and put it in the crowns and the roots of the plant for use the following spring. And so this ability to resorb nitrogen is something that perennial grasses do to a very high degree. Annual grasses do not resorb their nitrogen because that individual plant is not going to live to the next year and doesn't need that nitrogen to regrow. Instead, it puts as much of its nitrogen as it can into its seed, into its grain, because that's its opportunity to further its growth the following year. Finally, in prairies and in grasslands in general, we have a high degree of microbial associations. The legumes, of course, have their association with rhizobium, but there are also extensive networks of mycorrhizae, which are fungi that enter into a symbiotic relationship with grasses and other plants in prairies. And in fact, we've done research that's shown that about 2/3 of the nitrogen budget of a grass in a prairie comes through these mycorrhizal associations. These mycorrhizae access nitrogen that otherwise can't be gotten at by the plants. So the mycorrhizae can access organic nitrogen and help bring it into the plant before it turns into ammonium and nitrate, which are much more likely to be lost from the agroecosystem. And so anything that we can do to access that organic nitrogen before it's mineralized through the processes of ammonification and mineralization, anything we can do to slow that down and stop those processes or bypass them, if you will, then we're doing ourselves a favor because we're reducing potential loss pathways. So we'd love to use prairie and grasslands in our agricultural systems as much as possible because they are nitrogen use efficient, they retain nitrogen at a high level, and of course slow down the nitrogen cycle that helps us hold on to the nitrogen before it can get into our environment. That said, when we slow down the nitrogen cycle, there tends to be an inexorable trade-off, and that is they tend to be lower yielding agroecosystems. And so we fundamentally have to grapple with the fact that if we're going to conserve nitrogen, we're likely to have agroecosystems with reduced yields or lower yields. And so we have to find ways to incentivize farmers to plant cropping systems that will produce a little bit less. And that's a sticky wicket, to say the least.